gentlemen, as a matter of fact, we are ready for our next discussion. And the topic is combating ransomware, developing an international response. I will be moderating this discussion, and I'm happy to introduce our speakers. Mr. Craig Jones, Cybercrime Director, Interpol, who also participated last year, so thank you for coming again. Michael Daniel, President, CEO, and Cyber Threat Alliance. And Mrs. Teresa Walsh, Global Head of Intelligence, FS-ISAC. So, warm welcome to everybody. Threat intelligence, ransomware, quite a sensitive topic, and yet here we are talking, coordinating our efforts. Let's go straight to it. My first question is to all of you. From your point of view, how has the digital threat landscape changed over the last 2 years, and does ransomware take a special place in it? Could you please share some of the trends that you see today? Craig, could you please go first?
Thank you very much, Alexander, and it's really an honor to be back here for my third occasion, in fact, on this event. When we've been looking at the ransomware threats and how it's evolved in the last few years, we've also seen other threats around that as well. We've seen the phishing, business email compromise, network intrusion. So we've seen a whole range of threats. I think we're seeing more around ransomware now for a number of different reasons. Is the landscape, is it actually changing? I'm not sure the landscape's actually changing. What we're looking at is the vulnerability side. And we're looking at the vulnerabilities and the cybersecurity aspects. And the criminals are taking advantage of that. As we saw during COVID-19, they used a lot of the same tactics, techniques, and procedures, but there were greater opportunities for them at that stage. And ransomware is similar now. That's evolving as criminals are honing their techniques, their processes as well. They're looking at different areas which they can then exploit within companies, within organizations, and within businesses. And we're seeing that the volume increasing as well. One of the challenges we have in law enforcement is actually the recording and the reporting of cybercrime, and ransomware is no different within that. So the reporting that comes out to us, either on a national basis or global, we don't always see that reporting, but the criminals certainly are seeing it as a highly enticing and lucrative business model, because effectively that's what it is now. It's a business for them. And they evolve that business model. So initially it might be they would just encrypt and demand, but now you're seeing the encryption, the demands, but then also another demand that they will leak for data. You then see them combining that with a distributed denial of service attack as well. There were some interesting comments earlier around, are hospitals or health sector more vulnerable at the moment? And I think that was linked with the reporting. So that was being picked up in the press as well. And looking at how the criminals operate, this is a methodology they have for no borders and near impunity. So how do we address that challenge? I'm expect we'll talk about that a little bit later. But coming back and just summing up then is we are seeing this hitting the headlines now. And why are we seeing that hitting the headlines? There's the geopolitical aspect to this as well. So the countries are now talking at the governmental levels, and that is coming through very much in the reporting. Plus also the types of attacks having those secondary effects, which are then impacting directly on the communities. So we're seeing in the colonial pipeline, the shutting down of the systems of the organization then led to the shortages. So it was a secondary consequence, but that's when it starts impacting on communities. And also we've seen that in Ireland as well, with the attack in Ireland, where it impacted the Irish healthcare service systems. So they stopped some of those services, closed them down. So the service providers could then not use those systems, the communities were impacted. So again, now we're then seeing, two different types of impacts coming through. So that's the sort of threat landscape we're seeing and what's going on there from our side. And I'll hand it back now to you and some of the other panelists to have an input on this as well.
Thank you, Craig. Teresa, what's your take on this? What are the trends that you see?
Yeah, so from the financial services side, we do see a lot of the trends that Craig was talking about. One of the reasons why I think it seems so prolific now is also, it's a service, it's a business model, the ransomware as a service, where you don't have to be very knowledgeable yourself on how to create ransomware. You can just go into the underground marketplace and purchase a kit, purchase a phishing kit to help you distribute it, and then just reap the benefits of the Bitcoin Bitcoins coming in, as long as you give a little bit to the side to the operators behind the desk. And then, of course, with the double tap as well, as we call it, seeing the embarrassment, the reputational risk that comes along with some of these leak sites. And even if it's not true or not, your name's out there, your company's name's out there. They're saying that they've hacked you. They're saying that they have your customers' data. So this does have a lot of risks. And I think what's different from a few years ago is that you have non-technical people talking about ransomware now. Whereas maybe a few years ago, they didn't even know what that meant, and they didn't know what the side effects were. It's in the news, in the mainstream news. Every single week, you see a new attack of some sort or another. And I think one of the reasons it gets so much headlines is because now it is having a real physical impact. I think we all read the story last year about how somebody in Germany was heading to a hospital that was attacked by ransomware, so they weren't able to see the person and they died. So, it's not just about not having access to services, but there's actually a real physical impact as well. And it's not just about money, even though the money is quite lucrative as well. I mean, they have to do so little in order to get so much money. And now you do see that in the headlines, 50 million, 60 million, 70 million that they receive in Bitcoins or other types of currency in order to commit these attacks. So that's why I think a lot of non-technical people are paying attention, and that includes the chairman of the board and your other board of directors around you as well. So they're asking you questions, and that puts a lot more pressure on the security teams as well.
Thank you, Teresa. Yeah, financial institutions are definitely on the radar of cyber criminals. Michael, do you have anything to add to the threat landscape?
Sure. So first of all, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here and speaking to the Cyber Polygon. I would really sort of draw together what both Craig and Teresa were saying and highlight sort of four ways that I see the threat landscape having evolved. One is that, as they were saying, it's much more organized now, right? Like if your image of a hacker is someone in a hoodie still living in his mother's basement, that's not how the industry works now. And it is an industry. It is highly organized and it's very differentiated. So they've read their economics textbooks and they've diversified and they've got specialization. So now the whole criminal ecosystem is very organized and specialized. As Craig mentioned, it's much more intense, right? We're seeing a huge volume. And I think that links to what Teresa says about how easy it is to get into the market and how lucrative the returns are. It's much more diverse too. The threat landscape, you can now attack not just laptops and phones, but you could attack, devices, industrial control systems, a whole array of items. And then that links to my fourth point, which is that it's much more disruptive. We have hooked so much stuff up to the internet now that you can create a much greater degree of disruption than you could, say, 3 or 4 years ago. And so that really means, to my mind, ransomware has transitioned from being what was essentially an economic nuisance, and maybe a couple of cops in Craig's unit, cared about it, 6 years ago. Now suddenly it's a national security and a public health and safety threat, in addition to being a crime.
Thank you, Michael. Very interesting point you mentioned there about how organized cyber criminals are. They're like an enterprise, like an organization, the mastermind being the CEO, and then they got marketing and someone who develops the ransomware. Yeah, it's very, very interesting. My next question is for Teresa specifically. I know that FSISAC pays a lot of attention to the topic of ransomware, and you actually developed a list of recommendations for businesses on how to deal with this threat. Can you tell us what is the situation with ransomware today, and maybe share some practical cases of successful cooperation within FSISAC and how your recommendation helped your members to stop the attack?
Yeah, absolutely. So first and foremost, FSISAC is a community. We're a community of financial institutions. And that does really help us help each other when it comes to these types of situations. And I think everybody knows that we're pretty highly regulated, depending on what country in the world you're talking about. All financial services are very regulated. So we focus and invest a lot of money into cybersecurity because of that regulation, and because at the end of the day, we are controlling and managing a lot of money and investments and assets for customers all over the world. And we have to protect that. We have to protect our customers at the end of the day. So it's very important for them to understand what's going on in ransomware. I think if you do look at the open source trackers that are available and compare industry by industry, financial services isn't doing that bad, especially if you compare it to something like healthcare. But at the same time, we're not immune to the attacks either. And what we are seeing increasingly is our third parties, supply chains, providers that we depend on that are getting attacked as well, and potentially being used as a vector into our networks as well. So this is something that probably in the past couple of years especially, we've been paying much more attention to. And I think from our community side of things, we want to engage in what's called mutually assured defense, basically, where we are looking after each other. If you take it into the physical realm, and you're looking outside your business window and you happen to see somebody suspicious walking by, maybe they're carrying a weapon, you want to just not tell anyone. And this is the story you often hear when people talk about cooperation. You would tell someone, you would tell the office next to you, you would call the police, you would call, the security guard that is helping your industrial park or wherever you might be. And this is the same way in cyber. If you're experiencing some sort of event, some suspicious activity, you can share that information. And hopefully the other person can say, yes, we sold it too. And you can start to build a picture of what is happening, who's trying to attack you, what type of tools they're using to attack you. Can somebody else see the same thing you're seeing? And slowly you start to build that type of picture up. We've talked in the past publicly for FSISAC about how our community has banded together to compare notes about different types of cyber events. For instance, last year we had a very large campaign. It was a DDoS campaign that was attacking a lot of our members, but also other companies as well. And it was preceded with an extortion demand, an email usually that said, if you don't pay us this much money, we're going to attack you. And they would do an attack just to kind of show off that they could do it. And what happened is very early on, we started sharing that information to each other and saying, raising your hand and saying, I've seen this. Has anyone else seen this? And then slowly starting to see everybody else raising their hand and comparing the notes. And that's what we do as the community is we try to learn from each other. And if you see something happening to a peer, a company just like yours, you can try to see if it's happening to your company as well. And I think anytime a big incident happens, even if it's not within the financial sector, if it's like the Colonial Pipeline attack or something else, you want to know what's happening because you want to see, can the same thing happen to me? If I was attacked in the same method, would my company be able to withstand it? And it's through that type of learning and cooperation that we end up being more resilient. So I think for us, we're all in favor of cooperation. I know Interpol and others do quite a bit of that in their own industries as well. So I think just learning from each other, crowdsourcing the information, if you will, does have an impact. And on ransomware, I think you do see that quite a bit now, where you have no more ransom initiative that the Dutch police and Europol started, or has a lot of decryptors that companies have contributed to. So if you do have an attack, you can look to see if they have a list of decryptors that can help you. But you also have not just us, but a lot of other organizations, national cybersecurity agencies, police agencies that are sharing information for your small and medium sized enterprises, the ones that don't have 60 million to spend on their cybersecurity organization, but need to understand what can they do themselves to protect against ransomware and other threats, but then also what can you do to talk to your partners about the same thing and ask them, are they protecting themselves, and how you can learn from each other as well. And that's all about the community.
Thank you, Teresa. I hope there will be more communities like FSISAC in other industries. My next question is for Michael. Private sector is the primary target for cyber criminals using ransomware as it has the money. I have some numbers here. Research by Chainalysis shows that in 2020, the total amount paid by ransomware victims increased by 311%, reaching nearly 350 million worth of cryptocurrency. What can the private sector do to effectively respond to ransomware attacks? Maybe you can also share some best practices and interesting cases.
Sure. So I think that when you look across the board at what you can do about ransomware, it's actually the same practices that we've been talking about for good cybersecurity, whether we are talking about business email compromise or other kinds of cyber criminal activity. From the private sector point of view, I recently worked on the ransomware task force here in the United States. And we really talked about a set of 4 activities of deter, disrupt, prepare, and respond. And deterrence is largely in the realm of government. But in those other 3, the private sector has a lot of activities that they can do, including contributing and working with governments to help them with understanding the threat environment, understanding the actors, working with organizations like Interpol and national police agencies to actually disrupt what the cyber criminals are doing. But it's particularly in those last 2 areas of prepare and respond, of really focusing on investing in the cybersecurity basics. Cyber criminals are in this for the money. And so they are not going to spend an infinite amount of time trying all sorts of different ways to get into just your organization. So if you are investing in your cybersecurity, if you're following good cybersecurity practices like using multi-factor authentication on your accounts and segmenting your network and using virtual private networks and things like that, following those known best practices, you can really reduce the risk of being hit by ransomware. And then the other thing that I would say is being prepared to respond, knowing that having a ransomware attack is certainly a possibility, and planning out and thinking ahead of time about what you will do. And not just from a technical standpoint. As Craig has pointed out, as Teresa has pointed out, a lot of these attacks now involve the criminals stealing information and threatening to release it. So this means that you need to have already planned out ahead of time. How am I going to talk to my workforce? What are we going to say to our customers? How are we going to operate? So it's not just about the technical, it's about the legal, it's about the communications, it's about the whole aspect of responding to the ransomware incident that you need to have planned out ahead of time. And you need to know who you're going to call in your local government, in your national government. Know that ahead of time and have a relationship with them. As I always say, you do not want to be trading business cards in the middle of a crisis. You want to have those relationships built ahead of time. And then the last point I'll make before turning it back over to you is it's that collaboration point. The private sector has to be working together with itself, with across industry verticals, with the cybersecurity industry, with platform providers. But we also have to be working very much hand in hand with governments around the world, responsible governments that take this issue seriously and are working to actually disrupt what the cyber criminals are doing.
Thank you, Michael. Craig, Interpol is one of the most powerful international platforms that unites countries and law enforcement agencies. What are your recommendations? Do you have any best practices to share?
Yeah, thank you. I think just building out on the last 2 answers, there's a national aspect to this. So policing is constructed in a national way. It deals with laws, legislation, and polices within the country jurisdictions and boundaries. So that's one of the first challenges that we have. Have we moved quickly enough to do the international cooperation and collaboration? No, not at the moment. And that's an honest answer. We look at some really good regional models that we have such as Europol, EC3, and those sort of models. But again, that's just in a region. And again, that works well because you have countries have legislation, they have good funding, so that works well in that model. But on the international side of that, that's where we need to do more. And effectively, with the private partners that we work with, the private partners now are that first responder. So the 999 call goes out to private partners when there's a cyber incident. It doesn't come into the police. So we miss that early part of that investigation quite often. So what we don't do is pick up the evidence that we need to at that time. So when the private partners come out and support anybody that's been a victim, effectively they are there to help that business or organization get back up and running. So the evidence gathering goes on, but actually that may be watered down, tampered with not by intentionally, because the objective there is to get them back up and running effectively. So law enforcement come in after the curve on that. So that's where the private partnership, first of all, certainly on the international level, is working very well now. So working with the World Economic Forum and the Partnerships Against Cybercrime, we've done a huge amount of work in the last 18 months. We're specifically looking at how we manage our infrastructure, how we look at the threats, and then how we share those data. Now at Interpol, we have our Gateway partnership where we are now able to bring data in from private partners. And again, that brings in another layer of complexity about the sharing of data and the rules that you have to have in place for that, about privacy, DPA, all that sort of thing. So that brings in extra challenges. So that's now coming together, and we've seen operational examples of that. We've worked with private partners. We've identified threat actors in Nigeria, in Morocco recently, and just in the last week or so, we've undertaken an operation in Ukraine with the US, with Korea as well, against the ransomware group. Now that's an ongoing operation, but that's taken nearly 2 years worth of work to come to that stage, and there's still a lot more to do in that space. So that's bringing the law enforcement together then to do those operations effectively together, and also having law enforcement work in other countries as well. So, having people on the ground, that's really important. So Interpol's role within all of that is to coordinate, to facilitate. And we've got a number of platforms now available. We've got our collaborative platform for operations where we can bring them onto secure Interpol platforms. And as everybody knows, Interpol, it works around data and information, and we have to have that trust element in that as well. So that's the final piece I'll say in this is the trust. So what's that trust model like? We talk about in the virtual world, the zero trust model. We have to have that trust model in what we do to combat the cyber criminals, because guess what? They trust each other, they work together, and when it doesn't work, they move on and work with someone else. So again, that trust element for us and to build that out going forward is really vital.
Well, Craig, I think that if you keep participating in Cyber Polygon, eventually we'll get to the proper level of international cooperation. So thank you. My next question is to all the speakers. Let's talk about international regulations. I think you'll agree that today, international regulations are not sufficient for the level of cybercrime and specifically ransomware threats that we face today. What new policies can be developed to help fight ransomware within each individual country and at the international level? Michael, could you please go first?
Sure. So I think there's a number of different aspects to what you just raised. I think particularly when you talk about the cryptocurrencies and those new types of financial instruments, they are clearly part of the fuel that is enabling the ransomware boom. I mean, it's hard to imagine ransomware having reached the scale that it has reached without cryptocurrencies. Now, that does not mean that cryptocurrencies are the reason that we have ransomware, right? Ransomware was going on with gift cards and other types of financial instruments before there was cryptocurrency. But given that cryptocurrency now plays such a central role in ransomware, bringing those exchanges into compliance with the way that we deal with other parts of our financial system, know your customer regulations, anti-money laundering regulations, counterterrorism regulations, we really need to be looking at bringing the cryptocurrency realm into that greater the international financial structure. And then the other part that I would say is that we really need to increase the level of international cooperation among countries. And we really need to reduce the number of safe havens, places where criminals are allowed or even encouraged to operate where law enforcement cannot reach them. That is unfortunately part of the criminal landscape as well, and that is something that we need to reduce. But I think if we actually start really building those international connections, like what Craig was talking about, then I really think we could have an impact on the ransomware ecosystem.
Thank you, Michael. Teresa, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, really for us, when you talk about regulations, we automatically think of financial regulations, what's coming from our regulators and supervisors around the world. And I think one of the things I do see in the past few years is that more of them are getting interested in cybersecurity, information security. You have, Singapore's technical risk management guidelines. You have the new DORA coming out in the EU. And a lot of them are talking about resilience against these types of attacks, against these types of threats. What I would probably like to see more of is more of that discussion amongst them about what we usually call regulatory harmony. The harmony between what they're doing, what they're saying. It can be even as something as simple as definitions. I mean, in the law enforcement side, you have conventions that talk about what is crime, what is cybercrime, things like that. Depending on what country or even what sector within that country you're talking about, they could have completely different definitions of what is a data breach, what is a mandatory incident that you have to report, things like that. And so even though there is a multi-layered effect when you're talking about international cooperation between law enforcement, government security agencies, and private sector, you need to make sure you're talking the same language in terms of what does it all mean? What is a cybercrime? What is a data breach? What is ransomware even? Because not all ransomware is created the same. And you need to be able to understand how that's all interpreted in a single country, and then how you can start cooperating on that on the international level. And probably the only thing I'll say to that too is that it's not just about cybersecurity anymore. Cybersecurity is part of your daily life, as Michael was saying earlier, and you need to put that into business operations. Your ability to conduct your business functions. It's not just about a nice little cybersecurity policy anymore. It's about everything.
Thank you, Teresa. You mentioned harmony. Craig, I think Interpol is a perfect example of an organization which runs harmoniously worldwide. How do we bring harmony to international regulations?
So I think just skipping back to the national side, and Michael brought up the point about the task force and the report that was published recently. That had two sides to it I looked on. I had an internal focus looking at what they would be doing in a country effectively, and then an external international piece to it. What I found in the 2 years I've been at Interpol, and the harmony piece sort of ties into this, is there's a lot of good strategies out there, very well written, very well documented, evidence-based. If you then turn that around and look at the investment that then goes in onto the international side, and that's not just in terms of funding, that's people, process and technology. So where do you place those factors on a national, regional or global, and where can they have the most impact? My argument for law enforcement would be placing more on the international side would help reduce that global impact, because effectively then, and as we do at Interpol, over 100 different nationalities working here, drawing those different people together from law enforcement. We are a neutral organisation. We can be that interlocker between those countries that may not have those channels directly for law enforcement to work together. Michael made the point about the hard to reach jurisdictions. Why are they hard to reach jurisdictions? That's because we are not able to get law enforcement together on a national or regional basis. So doing it on an international basis with the neutrality of Interpol to help support, coordinate, facilitate those operations. And that's where we're moving more towards now, is about how we draw those operations in, working with private sector, bringing that data and information in, and then putting that together as an operation. We're non-executive. My role here as a seconded officer, I can't lead an investigation now. So that has to go into a country. And that's slightly frustrating at times, but actually it's a bonus because I have that neutrality aspect to it. So I can go into all these different countries, welcome into these countries, but I can challenge as well. And that's what we're doing more of now. And on Monday, we've got a global event for law enforcement. We're bringing leaders together, over 400 people on the Interpol event. And this is what we're looking at. It's the ransomware challenge. And we're asking for a commitment from law enforcement globally to work together against ransomware, using our platforms, using our capabilities, but more importantly, using the police globally with private partners as well to really draw all of their capabilities together, understand the threats and the impact, and then target our resources jointly against that. So there's a lot of movement going on now, but again, on that international level, for me, that's absolutely key.
Thank you, Craig. I believe we have 1 minute left, so I will now ask each of you to summarize all the points in very shortly in 20, 30 seconds, and maybe name some of the key steps that countries, businesses need to take to deal with ransomware. Teresa, could you go first?
Yes, so for individuals, you need to talk about protecting your data. What we would love to see in the sector is sharing more of the threat intelligence. And then as a national level or regional or international even, talking about that third-party risk management, how you can fortify your greater environment that's not just about you, but about who you rely on as well.
Thank you, Teresa. Michael?
I would say that it's really about integrating cybersecurity into what you do as a business and treating it as a cyber risk, as a risk that you have to manage across the board, just like you manage litigation risk or natural disaster risk, that it's not an issue that you can just send to a geek in a closet someplace and hope that it doesn't affect you. It's very much about running your business. And then at the national level, governments have to really prioritize cybersecurity, in particular, prioritize fighting ransomware both within the country and internationally.
Thank you, Michael. Finally, Craig?
And I think just building on the risk, so identification of the risk and reducing and closing those capability gaps, that's what we need to do. We need to reduce that. And that comes through collaboration and sharing information. But underlying all of that is the trust model. So the trust model that we have to have between law enforcement and private partners and the communities that we police, we have to have that very clear trust model, and for them to be seen that law enforcement is taking positive actions. We are arresting the cyber criminals. You know, there is a harm that we can do to them effectively because of the actions they're taking.
Thank you, Craig. Thank you, everybody, for your recommendations, and I hope to see all of you next year at Cyber Polygon.